After tens of thousands of miles and 4 years of full-time RV living, I've decided to completely overhaul our trailer suspension system from top to bottom. Tires, bearings, brakes, leaf springs, equalizers, wet bolts, and even the frame. It's all getting refreshed in this video, and I'm going to show you everything I do step by step. My game plan for the suspension refresh is to work from the frame down. With that in mind, this video has been divided into the following categories. Section 1, load and shock absorption. This covers every component between the frame and the axles. Section 2, rotation and braking. This covers the bearings, hubs, drums, and brake assemblies. Section 3, rims and tires. This is the final part of the suspension system and where the rubber meets the road. To give you an overview of our rig, we have a 2020 Grand Design Momentum 397TH. Our suspension came stock from the factory with 3 axles rated for 7,000 pounds each, electric drum brakes, 3.5K leaf springs, rubberized equalizers, and 6 Westlake G-rated tires. The entire RV has a gross vehicle weight rating of 20,000 pounds, which means when fully loaded with all of our stuff, the entire RV should never weigh more than that number. And taking into consideration all of our clothes, tools, equipment, and the daily driver loaded in our garage, it's hard to not use up every bit of that available payload. For the past 4 years, I've been careful to inspect the components before every major trip. I've also performed periodic maintenance every year or so. And luckily, so far, everything has held up without any major failures. But I am starting to feel like we're pushing our luck a little. So if I don't want to end up on the side of the road with a broken leaf spring, snapped frame hanger, or a blown out tire, the time to prevent those issues is now. I'm going to start here with a high-level overview of everything I'm looking to accomplish during this refresh, but I will be going through the entire step-by-step process later in the video, including a full rundown of all the tools and parts I use, as well as all of the ongoing maintenance tasks I'll be performing moving forward, so stay tuned for that if you're interested. With that being said, I have listed chapter markers in the description below, so you can easily skip to any section you'd like. You might also want to save this video for later, so you can come back to it when it's time to perform periodic maintenance on your own trailer suspension system. Section 1, load and shock absorption. The first potential point of failure in our suspension system is at the spring hangars. This is where the frame connects to the rest of the suspension components. These hangars are notorious for breaking due to rust, poor welds, or excessive lateral force when making sharp turns, especially on the triple axle units. The plan here is to clean and inspect the frame and spring hangars, apply a coat of Rust-Oleum rubberized rust reformer, and then reinforce these points with some additional heavy-duty hardware add-ons from MORryde. These bolt-on structures will provide lateral or side-to-side support and reduce stress on the frame and hangers by up to 94%. The next potential point of failure is the hardware fastening everything to the spring hangers, as well as the hardware holding all of the suspension components together. The plan here is to remove all of our old wet bolts and shackles and upgrade those to heavy-duty bolts and shackles from MORryde. These half-inch shackle links are stronger and more durable than the stock shackles, which mean the brackets are much less likely to stretch and break due to the stress caused by rough roads. The next components down the line are the rubberized equalizers that came installed on our rig from the factory. These are designed to absorb shock and reduce the front to back movement of the trailer during towing. The plan here is to remove our old and worn out Lippert Equiflex components and upgrade to MORryde's new AllTrek 4000 system for triple axles. These equalizers have around 40% more rubber than our old ones, and with 4 inches of suspension travel, they're able to absorb much more shock. They also come with an industry-leading 3-year warranty, which is 2 years longer than anything offered by Lippert. The triple axle kit also includes 2 side-to-side crossmembers, a set of front-to-back crossmembers, and 2 axle torque arms, all of which help to further dissipate torque and stress along the frame and axles. And then finally, we have the leaf springs. These stacks of U-shaped steel strips absorb a majority of the bumps and vibrations happening between the axle and the frame. Over time, springs can begin to flatten, reducing their shock absorbing capabilities, and the ends can eventually become fatigued and break. Even though we do have some slight flattening, I believe our stock springs have done pretty well over the past 4 years, so the plan is to simply replace those with brand new ones of the same style and rating, and then attach them to the axles with brand new U-bolts. Section 2, rotation and braking. Once all the components between the frame and the axles have been refreshed, the next potential point of failure is the wheel bearings, which are what enable the wheels to spin freely around the axle. Our rims are bolted to the hubs, and the hubs rest on and rotate around the spindle. Inside of each hub is an inner and outer bearing, an inner and outer bearing race, which is what the bearings ride on, lots of grease, and a front and back grease seal. The wheel bearings are the contact point between the hubs and the spindle, and they carry the entire load of each wheel. The plan here is to remove the hubs, clean out all of the old grease, inspect the spindles, bearings, and races for any abnormal wear, replace any damaged parts, repack the bearings with fresh grease, and then install new grease seals. The next point of potential failure is our electric drum brake system, which consists of a magnetic brake assembly and a drum inside of the hub. The plan here is to clean and inspect the brake assemblies and drums, replace any worn or damaged parts, and then clean and coat the exterior of the hubs with a high temperature rust resistant paint. Section 3. Wheels and tires. Once all of the components from the frame to the hubs have been refreshed, the next potential points of failure are the wheels and tires themselves. Our rig came stock from the factory with 6 G-rated Westlake tires mounted on 16-inch Lion's Head rims. The clear coat on these rims began to peel within just 3 months of purchasing our RV, but because we were traveling, I didn't take the time to report the issue until right outside of our warranty period. And even though I had documented photos from a repair shop proving the failure happened well within the warranty period, Lion's Head refused to take any responsibility for repairing or replacing our rims. So the plan here is to simply clean and inspect the rims, and assuming the structures look good, repaint those with a black rubberized coating. And then our final points of potential failure are our Westlake tires. Westlakes have a bad reputation for blowouts because of their E-rated tires, which have been known to be rather problematic, but their G-rated line has an excellent track record, and that's what we have on our unit. I also make sure to take really good care of our tires. I've kept the cold pressure within 3 to 5 psi of 110 since the day we moved into the rig. I drive at no more than 65 miles per hour, and I always keep the exterior of the tires protected from the sun and weather with a thick coating of UV rubber protectant. And although these tires have performed perfectly for us over the past 4 years, and they also have plenty of tread life remaining, they are coming up on 5 years of age since the manufacture date. So to be safe, to avoid a potentially dangerous and high cost blowout, the plan here is to replace these with a brand new set. So that's a full overview of everything I'm looking to accomplish during this refresh. Next up, I'm going to go over the exact parts and supplies I ordered for each section, and then I'll go through the entire installation process step by step. Again, chapter markers are in the description below if you need to skip to any particular section. Section 1. Load and shock absorption, parts and supplies. I'll list in the description below all the specific part numbers, quantities, and links to the items I'll be covering next, but you can also find them all at aroundthesunwego.com. Also, feel free to ask any questions you might have in the comments below, and I'll do my best to help in any way that I can. For cleaning the spring hangers and frame, I simply used a water hose, a firm bristled brush for scrubbing, Dawn dish soap, and then lots of blue heavy-duty disposable shop towels. For coating these freshly cleaned sections, I decided on a 32-ounce can of Rust-Oleum 2-in-1 Rust Reform and Seal, and a couple of standard paint brushes. The rust reforming ingredient transforms any existing surface rust into a protective layer of iron phosphate, and then the remaining chemicals dry into a thick rubberized sealant, all of which protects the frame and spring hangers and helps to prevent future corrosion. For reinforcing the spring hangers, I decided on the X-Factor Crossmembers from MORryde. These work by attaching to our existing spring hangers and providing side-to-side support, reducing stress by up to 94% at each attachment point, which is a huge deal for preventing bending and breaking of the hangers, springs, and other components. Our triple axle has 4 sets of spring hangers, so we need 4 cross members total. But the triple axle version of the AllTrek 4000 suspension kit that we're also adding on already includes 2 cross members for the 2 middle hangers. So that means we only needed to add on 2 of the X-Factor cross members, one for the front set of hangers and one for the back set. On a tandem or double axle, the AllTrek kit doesn't include any cross members, so in that case you'd need 3 X-Factor cross members to support all of your hangers. The cross members themselves are adjustable in width, so they fit pretty much any travel trailer or fifth wheel, but I did need to make sure there were no obstructions under the frame that would prevent the cross members from being installed, such as plumbing, electrical lines, things like that. While there were no obstructions between each set of equalizers, I did find a dump valve line between the very front hangers, as well as a sewer pipe between the very rear hangers. To work around this, MORryde offers a drop-down adapter kit, which lowers the cross member by a few inches, allowing you to bypass minor obstructions. This would work on our front set of hangers, but the sewer pipe was too thick at the back, and it didn't look like we'd be able to fit a crossmember there without completely rerouting the plumbing, which I didn't want to do. So I decided to go ahead and skip the rear support and only go with the front crossmember along with a drop-down adapter kit. MORryde also offers a correct track adapter kit for those who have a correct track alignment system installed from the factory. You can tell if you have this system by the yellow hexagons on your front and rear spring hangers. We don't have this, but I just wanted to mention it for those who might need to add on that adapter kit. For replacing our old bolts and shackles, I decided to upgrade to a heavy-duty shackle kit from MORryde. This kit includes half-inch shackle links, which are much stronger and more durable than the stock shackles. You can see the difference in thickness here. This kit also includes bronze bushings and greasable wet bolts. To find the specific kit we needed, I used the chart on MORryde's website, which was listed under technical specs on the shackle kit product page. For our triple axle, we needed the kit with the part number ending in 023. For replacing our old and worn out equalizers, I decided to upgrade to the AllTrek 4000 system from MORryde. Before ordering the kit, I used the qualification guide on MORryde's website to make sure the system would work on my specific rig. I'll provide a link to the qualifier in the description below. The tandem or double kit simply includes 2 equalizers, while the triple axle kit includes 4 equalizers, 2 side-to-side crossmembers, 2 front-to-back crossmembers, 2 axle torque arms, 2 axle brackets, and 4 U-bolts. I was curious why the triple axle kit included so many additional support structures, so I contacted MORryde and I was able to speak with an engineer. He informed me that their goal with this design was to dissipate the torque that occurs when controlling the position of the center axle. By using a side-to-side crossmember between each of the 2 equalizers, and then using front-to-back crossmembers to connect everything together, it helps to spread the torque across 3 feet instead of 3 inches, further reducing the potential for failure. I then measured from the center of one of my axles to the center of another in order to determine the size of my specific wheelbase, which ended up being 35 inches. Therefore, in my case, I needed to order the triple 35-inch wheelbase option. For replacing our old leaf springs, I decided to go with an equivalent 6-leaf 3.5K replacement from eTrailer. These are actually 3/8 of an inch shorter than our stock springs, but the slight difference in length doesn't cause any issues. And then for replacing our U-bolts, I went with an equivalent replacement kit from Redline. These bolts are 7 inches long, which is about 3/8 of an inch more than stock, but again, this slight difference in length doesn't cause any issues either. I was able to determine the specs of our stock springs and U-bolts by contacting the manufacturer of our rig, Grand Design, and providing them with our serial number. They were able to give me exact part numbers for each of our components, and I was able to use those to find equivalent replacements. So a quick recap of all the parts and supplies I used: a water hose, a brush, Dawn dish soap, shop towels, a can of Rust-Oleum 2-in-1 coating, a couple of paint brushes, 1 X-Factor Crossmember with 1 drop-down adapter kit, 1 heavy-duty shackle kit, 1 AllTrek 4000 triple 35-inch wheelbase kit, 6 leaf springs, 3 U-bolt kits. Section 2, rotation and braking, parts and supplies. I'll list in the description below all of the specific part numbers, quantities, and links to the items I'll be covering next, but you can also find them all at aroundthesunwego.com. Also, feel free to ask any questions you might have in the comments below. I'll do my best to help you in any way that I can. For cleaning all of the old grease off of the bearings and spindles, I simply used a ton of disposable gloves and a ton of disposable shop towels. For repacking the wheel bearings, I used a 1-pound tub of Lucas red and tacky grease along with a very helpful bearing packer tool. I then reached out to Dexter, the manufacturer of my axles, to get part numbers and specs for the grease seals, inner bearings, and outer bearings. They responded with a very helpful list of part numbers that I was able to use to find everything I needed. Assuming all of my bearings and races were in good shape, I would only need to buy 6 grease seals to complete this repack. But considering there was a possibility that some of the other components might need replacing, I decided to go ahead and preemptively purchase 6 complete bearing kits. These include an inner and outer bearing, inner and outer race, a double lip grease seal, and a new cotter pin. If my existing components look good, I can simply save the leftover parts as spares for the future. I also ordered a couple of extra grease caps in case I damaged any of mine during their removal. For cleaning off the brake assemblies and drums, I used 2 cans of non-flammable CRC brake parts cleaner and plenty of shop towels. Luckily, none of my brake assemblies needed to be replaced this time around, but in our first year of travel, 3 of our factory installed grease seals failed and completely soaked our brake shoes in grease, and I had to replace those. For replacing those assemblies, I decided to go with an equivalent self-adjusting replacement from Redline. For repainting the exterior of the hubs, I used some masking tape and a can of flat black Rust-Oleum high heat spray paint. So a quick recap of all the parts and supplies I used. Disposable gloves, shop towels, Lucas red and tacky 1-pound tub, handy packer bearing packer tool, 6 complete bearing kits. I only ended up needing the 6 grease seals, and I saved the rest of the parts as spares, 2 extra grease caps, brake parts cleaner, brake assemblies. I didn't need any of those this time around, but I have needed those in the past. Masking tape, Rust-Oleum high heat spray paint. Section 3, wheels and tires, parts and supplies. I'll list in the description below all the links and quantities of the items I'll be covering next, but you can also find them all at aroundthesunwego.com. Also, feel free to ask any questions you might have in the comments below. I'll do my best to help in any way that I can. For coating all 6 wheels, I used just under 5 cans of black Plasti Dip, which is a nice rubberized paint that holds up well, but is also easy to remove. For replacement tires, I'd originally planned to purchase an identical set of G-rated ST235/80 R16 Westlakes, since they'd done so well for us over the past 4 years. But looking around online, I had a hard time finding those in stock at a reasonable price. I was, however, able to find a great deal on an identical set of Salins. These are very highly rated tires with a great reputation, so I decided to go ahead and make the switch. I did a ton of research before making this purchase, and SimpleTire.com had the absolute best prices I could find anywhere. They also offered free shipping and 12 months of roadside assistance. And to save even more money, use code AROUNDTHESUN at checkout and you'll get an additional discount off of your purchase. So a quick recap of all the parts and supplies I used. 5 cans of black Plasti Dip, 6 G-rated ST235/80 R16 Salin tires. Section 1, load and shock absorption, step by step. Next up, I'm going to go through the entire installation process for section 1 step by step. Again, chapter markers are in the description below if you need to skip to any particular section. Before we get started, here's a quick overview of all the tools I personally use for this install. A 1/2-inch drive torque wrench with a range from 10 to 150 foot-pounds, a 16-ounce steel hammer, a basic pair of dikes, a 1/2-inch drive breaker bar, a 1.5-pound rubber mallet, a flat pry bar, a set of 1/2-inch extensions and a 1/2-inch swivel adapter, a steel punch, a 3/4, 11/16, 9/16, and 1/2-inch socket in 1/2-inch drive, 1/2-inch, 9/16, 3/4, and 13/16 combination wrenches, a 1/2-inch impact, a 4-ton bottle jack, some RV leveling blocks, a large C-clamp, 4 2+ ton jack stands. Also needed a deep 3/4 of an inch socket to torque the U-bolts on the leaf springs, and a deep 11/16 socket to torque the U-bolts on the control arm bracket. And then a quick recap of all the parts and supplies I used in this section. A water hose, a brush, Dawn dish soap, shop towels, a can of Rust-Oleum 2-in-1 coating, a couple of paint brushes, 1 X-Factor Crossmember with 1 drop-down adapter kit, 1 heavy-duty shackle kit, 1 AllTrek 4000 triple 35-inch wheelbase kit, 6 leaf springs, 3 U-bolt kits. To make things easier on myself, I started out this install by unboxing all of the new components and then loosely assembling everything on this picnic table with the included hardware so I could visualize where everything would go on the rig before actually beginning the install. This also helped me to confirm there were no missing parts and that everything was well organized before diving deeper. I first began by unboxing the X-Factor Crossmember and then the drop-down adapter kit. I went ahead and loosely attached the drop-down brackets to the Crossmember with the included hardware, and I also placed the wet bolts in where they would go. Once all of that looked good, I began to unbox the AllTrek 4000 suspension system, which included a lot more parts. I started out here by simply adding all of the new heavy-duty wet bolts and shackles onto each of the 4 equalizers. Once all of those were installed, I then put everything together on the table as it would be under the rig to make sure I had all of the parts and to visualize and make sure everything made sense. Once I was satisfied with how everything was laid out and organized, I unboxed the leaf springs from each trailer. As you can see here, these come stock with cheap nylon bushings, but I wanted to replace those with the copper bushings included with MORryde's heavy-duty hardware kit. To do this, I used a steel punch on the edge of the nylon bushing and then used a hammer to beat it out of the eyelet. I then took the copper bushing, pressed it into the eyelet as far as I could with my hands, and then used a C-clamp to press it in the rest of the way. I did this 12 times across all 6 springs. Now that all the parts were organized and prepped, The next step was to get all the tools together, jack up the rig, and remove the tires. I personally used our 6-point hydraulic leveling system to lift the entire frame high enough to remove the wheels. To reduce the length each leg had to extend, I placed leveling blocks under each foot and then used the app on my phone to extend the rear legs until the tires were just clear of the ground. Both Lippert and Grand Design advise against using the leveling system for jacking up the rig because there's always a freak chance that it could fail. The safest thing to do is place jack stands around the perimeter of the frame that can support the weight if the hydraulic system does fail. Now that the wheels are off, you can see quite a bit of surface rust has formed all along the frame and on all of the components. This is pretty much the result of salt, whether that's humid salt air on the coast or wet and salty roads in the wintertime. So the plan here is to clean and paint over all of this rust with a rust reformer, but before we can do that, we have to remove the old wet bolts, springs, U-bolts, and equalizers. To do this, you want to jack up your axles and support them with jack stands so the weight is removed from the springs, wet bolts, and equalizers. You can get the job started with 2 jack stands, but to complete this entire job, you'll eventually need a minimum of 4, and then ideally 6 jack stands if you have a triple axle like us. I only had 4 stands available, which meant I could only support 2 axles at a time. This was still doable, but a bit of a headache. If I had to do it over again, I would have just ran down to Harbor Freight and bought 2 more jack stands. I started at the front axle and used an impact gun to remove the old wet bolts and shackles from the equalizer. I then broke loose the 4 U-bolt nuts with a breaker bar and then removed them fully with the impact. There wasn't enough room between the nuts and the frame for the gun to fit, so I had to use a swivel adapter and a short extension. Once the nuts were off, I removed the hardware and both U-bolts. Make sure to watch out for any brake wires attached to the bolts and cut any tie straps as necessary. Next up was the bolt attaching the spring to the very front hanger. I had to break this nut loose with a breaker bar, and then I could remove it fully with the impact. I then used a steel punch and a hammer to move the bolt just enough to get a pry bar under the bolt head at the back so I could pop the bolt loose and remove it. At this point, I was able to lift and remove the old leaf spring, and as you can see here, the old bushings were absolutely destroyed on both sides of the spring. After doing this on both sides, you can see here the axle is now fully supported by the jack stands and is no longer connected to the RV. I then prepared this section of the frame and axle for a coat of rust reformer by rinsing them off, scrubbing with a firm brush and soapy water, and then using plenty of shop towels and degreaser to completely remove any old grease, dirt, and paint chips. Once everything was dry, I used a paintbrush to apply a thick coat of Rust-Oleum 2-in-1 rust reformer and sealant to the frame hangers, and the axle. I did this on both sides. Here you can see the difference between the freshly coated and uncoated surfaces. This particular product dries into a protective rubberized coating with a matte black finish. The next step was to jack up the middle axle and support it with jack stands so I could fully remove the front equalizers. Just like on the front spring hanger, I used a breaker bar to break the nut loose from the wet bolt. I also used it to break the nut loose from the bolt that connects the spring to the equalizer. I then removed both of these nuts with the impact. I used a hammer and punch to break the wet bolt loose from the spring and also to break the wet bolt loose from the hanger. This bolt came out easier than the first one, so I didn't have to use the pry bar. I pulled the wet bolt out of the spring and then supported the weight of the equalizer and pulled the bolt out of the hanger, which allowed me to fully remove the old Equiflex part. By the time I finished this on the other side, the rubber coating was now dry on the first section, and I was then able to install the new leaf springs on the front axle. I placed the spring into position and then used a jack to lift and shift the axle so I could get the holes in the hanger to line up with the holes in the spring. I then inserted a new wet bolt from the MORryde kit, making sure that the grease hole was facing upwards. I had to lift and pivot the spring a bit to get the bolt all the way through. Next up, you can see here that this bolt has teeth that need to be hammered into the hanger. To do this without damaging the grease fitting, I placed a socket on the head of the bolt and then hammered on the socket until the teeth dug into the hanger. Once the bolt was locked into place, the next step was to begin installing the X-Factor Crossmember. I slid the drop-down adapter bracket over the wet bolt, added the included spacer over the wet bolt, and then threaded the flange nut on by hand. Now that the drop-down bracket was held in place, I was then able to install the flange bolts and spacer tubes on both sides of the bracket, along with the hanger bracket plate and the nuts. Once those were hand tight, I used an extension and an impact to take the slack out of the nut on the wet bolt. Then I used a torque wrench set to 40 foot-pounds to snug it the rest of the way down. Once the wet bolt nut was torqued to 40 foot-pounds, I used a 1/2 inch socket and impact to take the slack out of the bracket plate nuts, and then used the torque wrench to torque each of these nuts to 25 foot-pounds. After this plate was tight, I re-torqued the wet bolt nut to 40 foot-pounds just to make sure it hadn't loosened. I then added all of these components to the other side of the frame as well. Once all of the hardware was properly torqued, it was then time to attach the outer and inner channels onto the drop-down adapter brackets. I started with the outer channel first, as you can see on the other side of the rig, and then I added the inner channel last. The easiest way I found to do this alone was to get one bolt started, add a nut, and then lift the channel up until I can get another bolt started, add a nut, and so on. Each side takes a total of 6 bolts. Once I had all 12 of these bolts hand tight, I was then able to push up on the center of the 2 channels to align the holes there, and then insert 4 bolts on each side using the holes farthest from the center. I used an impact to take the slack out of these nuts, and then used a torque wrench to tighten all of these to 40 foot-pounds each. Once all 8 of these nuts were torqued, I went back and tightened all 12 of the bracket nuts, 6 on each side, to 40 foot-pounds each. At this point, this entire hanger section is completely done. The frame and hangers have been cleaned and painted, the X-Factor drop-down crossmember has been fully installed, and the new wet bolts have been attached to the new springs. Next up was to paint the second section of spring hangers and frame, but before doing this, I wanted to remove the old U-bolts and springs from the middle axle so I could paint that area at the same time. So just like before, I broke the U-bolt nuts loose with a breaker bar, removed them fully with the impact, removed the old shackles and bolts from the rear equalizer, and then lifted and removed the spring. Here you can see another completely destroyed bushing. I removed the spring from the other side of the RV as well, and then scrubbed, rinsed, and painted this section of the frame, hangers, and axle. Once the paint was dry, I then installed the new front pair of MORryde Equalizers. To do this, I simply inserted a new wet bolt through the hanger and equalizer, ensuring the grease hole was facing up. And then I used a socket and hammer to force the teeth of the bolt into the hanger. Once both equalizers were installed and the new bolts were locked into the hangers, the next step was to install the first crossmember that was included with the AllTrek 4000 triple axle kit. These are a bit more difficult to install than the X-Factor crossmembers because not only is the mounting bracket and crossmember welded together as one piece, meaning you need to lift and support the entire crossmember to get the mounting nut started, but there also isn't a lot of room for your fingers to access the nut. To accomplish this alone, I started out by using a bottle jack to lift the crossmember into position, but it wasn't tall enough and I was out of leveling blocks to add additional height. So then I decided to wedge a pry bar between the jack and the crossmember, which ended up working perfectly to lift everything up into position. Once the crossmember was pressed securely against the underbelly, it was then stable enough for me to get the mounting nuts started and finger tight. Next up was to install new wet bolts and shackles between the front springs and the front equalizers. I like for my grease fittings to face outward this way, so in the future I can easily access them without having to crawl underneath the rig. Once the new shackles and nuts were hand tight on both of the front equalizers, I began to install the new U-bolts on the springs of the front axles. I placed the new plate into position on top of the spring, made sure there was no debris on the threads of the new bolts, and then ran them up around the axle and through the plate, making sure to avoid pinching any of the brake wires. I then used an impact to gently snug all 4 nuts so that the spring was secured firmly in position against the axle and there couldn't be any shifting, but I didn't fully tighten or torque anything yet. Now that the front axle and springs were attached to the new equalizers, next up was to attach the middle axle and springs. I placed the middle springs into position on the middle axle so I could then install the new wet bolts and shackles. But as you can see here, the axle was too high, so I removed the bottle jack from the crossmember since it was now supported by the nut I'd previously gotten started, and then I used this to lift the axle so I could lower the jack stand. After making these height adjustments on both sides, I was able to install the new wet bolts and shackles and hand tighten all the nuts. Next up was to install the inner torque crossmember on the driver's side of the rig and secure it with a nut. Just like on the curbside, I used a bottle jack and pry bar to lift the crossmember into position so I can get the nut started. And then before removing the jack, I installed the flange bolts, spacer tubes, and hanger bracket plates to give each side some additional support. I hand tightened these nuts, but I didn't torque them yet. I was then able to remove the jack, and both the inner and outer cross members remained in place. Next, I needed to remove the old springs from the rear axle, as well as the old rear equalizer. But before I could do that, I needed to jack up the rear axle and support it with jack stands. Since the front axle was now attached to the frame via the new springs and front equalizer, I was able to remove those jack stands and let the axle hang. I then used these for supporting the rear axle. If I had 6 jack stands to start with, I wouldn't have had to worry about this step. Once the rear axle was supported, I removed the rest of the shackles, the old wet bolts, the old equalizers, and then also the bolts from the rear spring hangers. Again, using breaker bars, punches, and hammers whenever necessary. Now that the rear axle was free from the frame, I then removed the old U-bolts and the old springs. As you can see here, this spring doesn't even have a bushing in it. With all the old parts gone, I again rinsed, scrubbed, and painted the third and final section of spring hangers, frame, and the rear axle. Once the paint was dry, I installed the rear equalizers in the same manner as the front ones. I then installed wet bolts and shackles between the middle spring and rear equalizer. Next, I set the rear springs into place and again jacked up and shifted the rear axle in order to get the wet bolts and shackles to fit. Then I hand tightened the nuts. Next was to slide the final outer torque crossmember onto the new wet bolt and fasten it with a nut. I used the same bottle jack and pry bar technique to hold everything in place while I started the nut. Here's where I made a huge time-wasting mistake though. On the first set I did earlier, I attached the passenger side crossmember first, and it luckily worked out for me. But the second set is reversed, so you want to make sure to attach the driver's side crossmember first this time, which has slots, and then attach the curb side crossmember second, which is the one with circular holes. As you can see here, I unknowingly started with the wrong one on the curb side, and I even had to do it twice because I dropped it the first time. I was getting cocky and even attached the entire hanger bracket and bolts, but in the end I had to completely remove all of this anyway and do the driver's side first. So don't make the same mistake I did. Start with the driver's side inner crossmember. But now that those cross members and hanger brackets were in place and all of the new wet bolts and shackles were attached, I went ahead and installed the new U-bolts on the springs of the middle axles. I used the jack to lift and shift the axle a bit so everything would line up properly. Again, I tightened the nuts just enough to secure the springs firmly in position against the axle so there could be no shifting, but I didn't fully tighten or torque yet. Next, I installed the final wet bolts through the rearmost hangers and springs. I had to drop the rear axle down lower than the springs so I can get all the holes to line up properly. Once the teeth were hammered into the hangers and I'd hand tightened the nuts, I then lifted the rear axle back up and installed the last set of U-bolts, again tightening the nuts just enough to secure the springs firmly in position. Now that most of the hardware was installed, it was time to do some torquing. I moved all the way back to the very front axle and torqued both sets of U-bolts to 70 foot-pounds in a crisscrossing pattern. Because of the length of the new U-bolts, a standard socket wouldn't work, so I had to use a deep 3/4 inch socket. I then torqued both sets of U-bolts on the middle axle to 70 foot-pounds, and then both sets on the rear axle to 70 foot-pounds. Once all the U-bolts were torqued on both sides, I began to torque all of the new wet bolts to 40 foot-pounds using an 11/16 socket and a 13/16 wrench. Once all the wet bolts were torqued to 40 foot-pounds on both sides, I began to torque all of the flange bolts on the hanger bracket plates to 20 foot-pounds with a 1/2 inch socket and a 1/2 inch wrench, making sure to do no more than a half turn on each side until each pair of nuts were torqued. Once all of the hanger bracket plates were torqued, I crawled under the rig and added 4 3/8 bolts and nuts on each side of the middle and rear cross members using the holes farthest from the center. I then removed the slack from all of these nuts and torqued them all to 40 foot-pounds. Now that all 16 horizontal crossmember nuts had been torqued, it was time to install the front to back crossmembers. I started with the outer crossmembers with slots. They attach here to the front AllTrek side-to-side crossmember with these bolts. I began by hand threading these bolts in as far as they'd go, and then gently tapping them the rest of the way through with a rubber mallet. I then slid the crossmember onto the bolts and secured it in place by hand tightening the included nuts. Once this was done on both sides, I followed the same steps to install the inner crossmembers. I inserted the mounting bolts from back to front this time using a rubber mallet, then slid the cross members onto the bolts and held them in place with the nuts. On the driver's side, I found that my sewer line was in the way of allowing me to insert the bolt back to front, so I ran just that one in the opposite direction, and it seemed to work out just fine. I then added 3 3/8 bolts and nuts on each side of the front to back cross members. Once all 12 of those were hand tight, I torqued the 4 mounting bolts on each side to 95 foot-pounds. To do this, I used a 3/4 inch wrench to hold the bolt heads in place and a socket with a short extension to torque the nuts. Once all 8 of those were secure, I torqued the 6 3/8 bolts and nuts to 40 foot-pounds on each side. With all 12 of those torqued, it was then time to mount the axle torque brackets on the middle axle. I put this bracket on here, and then I just put these U-bolts loosely. Then I put these wet bolts through here and fasten this here. Then I removed the jack stands so the axle would drop down and sort of pull on this, which helped to straighten this bracket horizontally, because when I had the jack stands on it, the axle was too far forward and this was like tilted forward. Taking those away and letting the axle drop down sort of made the axle pull to the left, and that better straightened this bracket. And now I'm gonna try to tighten these U-bolts a little bit, just snug them up to try to pull the bracket even closer to the axle. And then that way we'll be able to get a bolt through here. We need to get a bolt through here behind these U-bolts. So this bracket needs to rotate and pull tight so these holes will clear these U-bolts. So that's what I'm doing next. So I used the bottle jack to lift the axle up so I can pull and push it and get this bracket to rotate enough for me to get this past these U-bolts. So now I was able to insert this here. I then torqued these U-bolt nuts to 40 foot-pounds each in a crisscross pattern using a deep socket 11/16. And finally, I torqued this bolt and nut down here to 40 foot-pounds using a 9/16 socket and wrench. I did all this on the other side, and then that completes this part of the installation. The only thing left is to grease all 28 of the new wet bolts, which includes 14 grease fittings on each side, 12 facing the exterior, and 2 facing inside on the torque arms. Section 2, rotation and braking, step by step. Next up, I'm going to go through the entire step-by-step process for Section 2. Again, chapter markers are in the description below if you need to skip to any particular section. So a quick recap of all the parts and supplies I use in this section: a flathead screwdriver, a rubber mallet, disposable gloves, shop towels, Lucas red and tacky 1-pound tub, handy packer bearing packer tool, 6 new grease seals, brake parts cleaner, masking tape, Rust-Oleum high heat spray paint. So the first thing we want to do is wipe off any spider webs, dust, and dirt from the outside of the hub. Then we're going to use a rubber mallet or hammer to gently work a flathead screwdriver in between the grease cap and the hub. The thinner the end of the flathead, the better. It's going to be a tight fit in there. You want to try your best not to damage the dust cap more than necessary. If you do end up bending or denting it enough to where it won't properly seal when you put it back on, you're going to want to go ahead and replace that with a new one. I can usually reuse most caps, but I have damaged a cap or two over the years. Once the edge of the flathead is in between the lip and the hub, rotate the hub and evenly pry the edges of the cap away until you can remove it. Then it's helpful to put a towel down so you have a spot to place all the components you're going to remove next. You can use the flathead to pop off the spindle nut retainer, and then you can remove the spindle nut counterclockwise. Then you can remove the washer and the outer wheel bearing. You can gently pull on the hub to help release these components. Then to easily remove the rear grease seal and inner bearing, there's a trick that you can do here so you won't have to use any type of seal pulling tools. I put the washer back on and then I hand tighten the spindle nut. Then I gently pull the hub towards me until I feel it release and drop down a little bit. Then I grab the hub at the top and the bottom and then firmly and quickly jerk the hub towards me. It might take 2 or 3 solid jerks to eventually break the seal loose, but then you can fully remove the hub. Now you can remove the spindle nut, washer, and the inner bearing and grease seal. and this grease seal can be thrown away because this is what's going to be replaced with a brand new one. You then want to wipe all of the old grease off the spindle with a few shop towels. And then next up, you want to inspect the brake assembly and make sure there's no grease on any of these components. If it's grease free, you can simply wipe away the spider webs and dust buildup. If you do see grease though, that means your grease seal was leaking, and you're going to want to make sure that absolutely no grease made its way to the actual braking material, the pads. If it did, chances are it's already soaked deep into the shoes, and no amount of cleaning will ever be able to properly recover it. In this case, the entire brake assembly needs to be replaced. You'll also want to replace the assembly if the thickness of your shoe pads are 1/16 of an inch or less, or if the wear indicators on the magnet are wore down so much that they aren't visible. You can see here our pads have plenty of thickness left, and there are plenty of tiny holes visible on the magnet, so this assembly is good to go. You also want to inspect the electrical wires and make sure they aren't nicked or damaged, and when you pull the magnet forward or back, the brake shoes properly expand and contract. If any of these components are damaged or aren't working properly, you'll want to replace the entire assembly. Replacing one of these is pretty simple. At the back, there are 2 black wires coming out of the brake assembly and connecting to the RV's wiring. You can simply cut these wires. You can then remove the 5 mounting nuts and then pull the entire assembly away and replace it with the new assembly. Simply hand tighten the nuts back in an alternating star pattern similar to lug nuts on a wheel, and then torque those to around 50 foot-pounds. Then you can connect the black wires from the new assembly to the RV wires with some weather-tight butt splices. There's no polarity, so which wire goes where doesn't matter. And then now you have a brand new brake assembly. If you're keeping your old assemblies though, you want to spray them down with brake cleaner to get as much of the old dust and grime buildup off as possible. You then want to inspect the spindle and make sure there are no holes, grooves, or pitting. You specifically want to fill the back where the grease seal rests, the middle where the inner bearing rides, and the front where the outer bearing rides. Each of these sections should feel smooth as glass. Next, you want to clean all of the old grease out of the hub with some shop towels. You then want to use brake cleaner and towels to clean the inner surface of the drum that comes in contact with the brake shoes and the inner surface that comes in contact with the magnet. You also want to inspect these surfaces for grooves and ridges and make sure they're smooth as well. Next up is to repack the bearings. To do that, I like to use this handy packer, which speeds up the process quite a bit. You simply remove this handle, place the bearing inside, and then give it a firm push, and it forces all the old grease out and forces new grease in within a couple seconds. You can fill the device up with a grease gun, which takes quite a while, but I've found the easiest and fastest way is to screw this handle on clockwise and then pull it open and then dump a tub of grease in with a spoon or knife all at once. You can then put the press back on and squeeze all of the air out, then unscrew the handle, and it's ready to pack. Take a bearing and wipe it clean with a towel, trying to get as much of the old grease off as possible. Then you want to inspect the bearing, looking for any lines, grooves, pitting, or anything that shows wear on both the exterior rollers and the inside. If you find any problems, you'll want to replace the bearing with a brand new one. Take the bearing and place it in the handy packer with the small side down, place the handle on top, and then push down until the old grease is forced out and you see new grease. You can then remove the bearing from the packer and wipe all of the old black grease off, leaving plenty of new grease. Then you want to completely work in all of the new grease and completely cover the bearing front to back. As you can see here, this is a freshly packed bearing compared to a bearing with the old dirty black grease. At this point your hands will be filthy, but just go ahead and clean off the next bearing with another towel while also cleaning off your hands. Again, looking for any problems or wear on the rollers or inside of the bearing. Use the packer to repack this bearing, then again, remove the old black grease, and then fully work the new grease into and all over the bearing, making sure it's fully coated. Once you perform this for all of your axles, you should at this point have all completely clean and functioning brake assemblies, clean and smooth spindles, clean and smooth hubs, and all freshly packed bearings. I like to place all of my smaller outer bearings on the towel beneath my axles with the rest of the parts and keep the larger inner bearings aside for the next step. At this point, I decided to coat the exterior of my hubs with a flat black high temperature paint, but you can skip this part if you'd like. I used some masking tape to cover the grease cap holes, I then hand tightened all of my lug nuts onto the studs, not only to protect the threads from paint, but also because the black lug nuts would look great with our black rims. Once all of the hubs were dry, I removed the lug nuts. Next, with the hub facing down, grab the freshly packed inner bearing and place the small end down into the center of the hub. Try to avoid getting any grease on the inside rim or any of the braking or magnet surfaces. If you do, make sure to wipe it off completely. Take the new double lip grease seal and place it into position over the bearing. Use a rubber mallet to softly and evenly tap the seal into the hole. The goal is to get the back of the seal to be flush with the opening of the hole. You don't want to tap the seal in too deep. You can carefully do this with a mallet, but I like to use my bearing race and seal driver toolkit. Once the back of the seal is flush, it's time to put the hub back on the spindle. Gently slide the hub onto the spindle and see if the brake shoes will fit inside the drum. If the drums won't go all the way on, we'll need to adjust the brake shoes by using the small gear at the bottom of the brake assembly. There's a tab that locks the gear in place, so you'll need to press on that while using a flathead screwdriver to rotate the wheel towards you. This will bring the shoes closer together. In our case, it took about a quarter turn to adjust the shoes enough for the drum to fit. Once the hub is all the way on, press it tight and rotate it left to right. You want to hear the shoes barely touching the drum, but you don't want any friction or resistance. If you don't hear any contact at all, you want to adjust the shoes out just a bit. If you feel any resistance, you'll want to adjust the shoes in just a bit. When you hear contact but don't feel resistance, the shoes are adjusted properly. Next, take the freshly packed outer bearing and insert the small end into the hub and onto the spindle. Wipe the old grease off of the washer and place that on the spindle. Wipe off the nut, making sure the threads are 100% clean, and then hand tighten it onto the spindle and up against the washer. Next, you want to torque this nut to at least 50 foot-pounds. I didn't have a socket that big, so I simply used a pair of channel locks and tightened as much as I could. Rotated the hub back and forth, tightened again, spun the hub, and tightened again. Once I felt like the nut was tightened to 50 foot-pounds, I broke it loose in reverse, hand tightened it again with my fingers, and then backed off by just a millimeter. I then popped on the retaining clip which locks the nut in place. The final step is to wipe the grease cap off, making sure the side walls are free of grease, and then place it into the hole. I then used a rubber mallet to gently and evenly tap in the edges as I rotated the hub. I made sure to tap gently because this cap will dent and bend. Once the cap is fully seated, the hub is sealed, and you're done. Now the only thing left is the wheels and tires. Section 3, Wheels and Tires, Step by Step. Next up, I'm going to go through the entire step-by-step process for Section 3. Again, chapter markers are in the description below if you need to skip to any particular section. So a quick recap of all the parts and supplies I used in this section. 5 cans of black Plasti Dip, 6 G-rated ST235/80 R16 Sailin tires. When coating all 6 wheels with Plasti Dip, I wasn't too worried about overspray on the old tires since I was having new ones installed. So the process for me was pretty easy. I simply removed the wheels from the rig and thoroughly washed and dried them. Again, you can see here how terrible the stock finish looks up close. I then laid the wheels out on some cardboard and applied a very thin and light first coat. I let that dry for 30 minutes and then applied 4 additional coats, each one a bit thicker than the last, letting each coat fully dry for 30 minutes. The key to avoiding runs in the paint is to use a steady sweeping motion and never spray in one spot without moving. Also, be patient and don't go too thick on any single coat. The 5 layers will eventually add up to a full thick coverage, and if they don't, you can simply add a 6th or 7th coat until you're satisfied with the look. When ordering our new Sailin tires from SimpleTire.com, I had them shipped to a tire shop just down the road from us. The plan was to load our wheels in the bed of the truck, drive them down to the shop, have the tires swapped, and then drive back and reinstall. But once the tires were delivered, I received a call from the shop letting me know their machines weren't big enough to mount 14-ply tires. I made some calls and found a shop a few minutes up the road that had the proper equipment. Luckily, I had enough room in the bed of the truck to load the 6 new tires along with the 6 old ones and head up to the other shop. So before placing your order, make sure to find a receiving shop that can actually handle the mounting of G-rated or 14-ply tires. I asked the installation guys to take it easy on the freshly painted rims during the tire swap, but unfortunately the rim still got a few scuffs here and there, so I did have to go back and touch those sections up. If I could do it over again, I would have waited until after the new tires were installed to paint the rims. But I'm very satisfied with how it all turned out in the end, and the fresh rims and tires make our 4-year-old rig look brand new again. And that's about it for the step-by-step of this entire process. After the entire refresh was complete, we took a short shakedown trip with the RV fully loaded. I wanted to give the entire suspension a chance to settle in at highway speeds under the full weight of the RV. After around 80 miles, I climbed back under the rig to check and retort every single bolt from the install. There were definitely a few that needed to be snugged again, so I believe this was a very important step. It's now been a little over 6 months since I completed this refresh, and in that time, we've traveled over 5,000 miles. From day one, I could definitely notice a difference in the ride quality. It felt as if the suspension was now the component absorbing the bumps and the frame was softly bouncing after the fact, whereas before, it felt like the trailer itself was taking most of the beating. The most noticeable improvement is when going over bridge transitions. I can feel the new equalizers and leaf springs absorbing the massive blows and then gently transferring the remaining energy to the trailer, which then gently bobs up and down a time or two. The biggest benefit though is the peace of mind we now feel. I'm no longer stressing about every single bump in the road, and when it's necessary to make those slow, sharp turns in a tight campground, I feel much more confident that we aren't going to bend a hanger or pop a spring getting into our spot. I'm also much less worried about a tire blowout simply due to old age. Needless to say, it's been a stress-free 6 months of travel. Now that the suspension has been completely refreshed from top to bottom, there are a few maintenance tasks I'll be performing from here on out to keep everything in tip-top shape. The biggest threat to an RV's tire is low pressure. That's why before every trip, I make sure the cold pressures of ours are within 3 psi of 110. I usually check this early in the morning before the sun has a chance to heat the tires up and increase the pressure. Low pressure can not only cause excess wear, but also creates excessive heat, which can quickly break down the rubber of the tire and cause a catastrophic blowout, especially when carrying heavy loads. This is why we also use a TPMS or tire pressure monitoring system anytime we travel. This system allows us to monitor the pressure and temperature of all tires on the RV and truck in real time and alerts us if there are any issues. Considering we're moving 30,000 pounds at 65 miles per hour, a blowout could not only be dangerous to us and everyone around us, but could also cause serious damage to our equipment. So being able to watch for temperature spikes or pressure losses in real time allows us to quickly pull over and take care of any issues before we have an actual explosion. We've been using this TST system for the past 4 years and it's worked great. I'll put a link to it in the description below. 110 psi is the max recommended cold pressure for our G-rated Salins, so that's what I run. You can Google load and inflation charts for your particular tire if you'd like to see all the potential load ranges based on PSI. But essentially, the higher the PSI, the heavier the load each tire is rated to handle. According to our chart, we would technically be alright running as low as 80 PSI on these tires, but I'd rather play it safe and have maximum load capacity at all times. I also perform a quick visual inspection of the wheels, tires, and suspension before every trip to make sure nothing looks out of the ordinary. On a monthly basis, I like to make sure our lug nuts are torqued to 120 foot-pounds. I also check the tires for any cuts, bulges, or uneven wear. I check the wheels for cracks or damage. I check the suspension for any broken bolts, shackles, or springs. I also make sure I don't see any bent hangers or problems with the frame. Every 6 months, I like to give all of these Zerk fittings on the suspension a good pump or two of grease. This keeps the wet bolts nice and lubed and reduces the friction and wear on all of the attachment points. I also like to pop off the dust cap on all of the hubs and give the easy lube fitting a pump or two of grease. This will make sure the bearings have plenty of grease in between repackings. I make sure to only give 1 or 2 pumps here though, because putting in too much grease can blow out the seals and cause grease to leak all over the brakes. Dexter recommends repacking your bearings every 12,000 miles or 12 months, whichever comes first. But since I inspect and add a bit of grease every 6 months, I personally base ours on miles and only repack every 12 to 24 months. The same goes for brakes. The recommended inspection interval is 12 months, but I simply inspect them when I repack the bearings. From here on, I'm also going to retorque all the new suspension components on a yearly basis, as well as take care of any surface rust that may begin to form on the frame, hangers, and other components. So I hope you guys found this video helpful. Make sure to save it to your account or share it with yourself so you can easily come back to it anytime you need to perform suspension related work on your trailer. If you have any questions or feedback on anything I cover here, make sure to drop a comment below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. I'd like to thank MORryde for all the amazing products I was able to use during this refresh and for consulting with me during the install and answering any questions I had. I'd also like to thank SimpleTire.com for their super fast shipping and fantastic prices. Again, don't forget to use code Around the Sun at checkout to save some additional money with any tires you purchase from them. My name is Chris Dow. This is Around the Sun We Go, and remember, make every trip count.